Enchantress decks can fall into two main categories: auras and non-aura, quote-unquote, normal enchantments. Both styles of decks are a ton of fun, and I will be covering both of them in this guide. But before I get into that, if you like my guides, consider subscribing. Thanks. I'm going to start with aura-based decks. Generally, these tend to be in white and green, but there are auras in all colors, and you could really go any color combination you want. Many aura decks like to play Enchantress effects. This is a term given to creatures that draw you cards when you cast an enchantment or an enchantment enters play. Oftentimes, these auras will buff up your creatures and make them stronger. This archetype oftentimes has a lot of overlap with the Voltron style of play, where you put all your buffs on one creature to make it massive so you can punch into your opponents. And it can be a ton of fun, especially because many auras give lots of keywords. The problem is, putting all your eggs in one basket makes you really susceptible to removal, because unlike equipment, when the creature dies, you lose all the auras as well. So if you want to go the Voltron-y route, you're going to want to pack a lot of protection with auras that give keywords like indestructible, totem armor, or hexproof. Watch out for auras that give shroud, since it'll prevent you from casting more auras on the creature. And also watch out for things that give protection from a color that you play, since it will knock off all the auras of the color and you won't be able to play more. Sadly, most of these protection spells don't actually save you from things like Cyclonic Rift or Farewell. If you find these cards are tripping you up a lot, then maybe try out Nevermore effects to stop these cards. Basically, cards that allow you to name a card and then stop players from casting it. I've been testing out Null Chamber lately, and it's pretty sweet. I usually ask one of the other non-blue decks at the table if they don't want to get hit by a Cyc Rift this game, and then I convince them to name Cyclonic Rift, while I get to name someone else's commander. It's pretty strong. Also, these Nevermore effects are enchantments, so they work well with your other enchantment synergies. Another tip for aura-based decks is to play auras that ramp you, if you're in green. These are great ramp spells that also trigger all your Enchantress effects. An example of an aura commander that I really love is Mazi. I built a Mazi deck for a buddy of mine, I'll have a link in the description, and it works really well. You can play auras with totem armor that protect your creatures, and then if somebody tries to board wipe, you only lose the auras, and then Mazi lets you recast all of them next turn to protect your team again. It also makes your board wipes essentially one-sided, helping you swing in for damage. Plus, recasting all of those enchantments triggers your Enchantress effects again and lets you draw many more cards. If you play a sacrifice outlet like Oratog, you can keep sacrificing any enchantment and replay it over and over again to draw a ton of cards. She also gives trample to any creature with an aura attacking an opponent. And the wording there matters a lot, since it means that if you put an aura that goads a creature and it attacks an opponent, it will also get the +2 attack and trample. Playing some goad effects like this can be really fun in a Mazi deck. I think she is a really underrated commander for auras. The next example of an aura deck I want to give is Hakim, which I picked specifically because he is not a stack all my auras on one creature and punch people commander. You could go mono blue Voltron, although that is a bit jank with the way he works, because he only lets you reanimate an aura from the graveyard if he has none on him. But in blue, there's a lot of auras that steal creatures. These are decently powerful as is, but with Hakim, you steal the creature and it dies, and then you use your commander to put the aura on him, which doesn't do anything because you already control your commander. But then you can use cards like Aura Finesse or Crown of the Ages to move the control magic onto an opponent's creature and then steal that. And if that creature dies, then you can just bring the control magic onto your commander again and move it to another creature. This commander is a tad clunky and needs some other cards to get going, but the engine is pretty powerful once you find the pieces. And it's an aura-based control deck, which you really don't see much of, so I wanted to highlight it. Okay, on to non-aura decks. Decks that focus on playing these enchantments usually don't use creatures as often to win. They're often slower control decks. They get value over time and oftentimes use tokens to win. Like if you play shrines, the shrines trigger on each upkeep, and you need to have multiple out and wait multiple upkeeps to generate the value that's going to push you to winning the game. You're not going to see these decks come out the gate swinging and knock a player out really early with damage. They also don't combo super well. Like, there aren't as many enchantment-based infinites as there are with artifacts or creatures. And because enchantments often need an upkeep to come around before they do something, they're just inherently going to be more susceptible to removal, since sorcery speed removal can stop most of their effects. These are the main weaknesses of enchantment decks. But if you don't mind a slower, slightly grindier deck, then these can be a lot of fun. One way to win with these is a token build, like Daxos the Return. Early game, you can play enchantments that make it hard for people to attack you. Things like No Mercy or Ghostly Prison. Eventually you get a bunch of experience counters on you, and then your commander is starting to make huge creatures. If you're making 2 or 3 7/7 beaters every turn, you're eventually going to just overwhelm the table. Plus, you can easily buff up those tokens with stuff like Intangible Virtue or True Conviction. Another way to build non-aura enchantments is by animating those. Zur the Eternal Schemer is an awesome commander for this style of deck. He animates enchantments permanently and gives them keywords so your enchantments are just more efficient as creatures. Alternatively, you can use cards like Opalescence or Starfield of Nyx to do this. I'm going to warn you that this style of deck is really not very powerful in casual commander. The power of these enchantment decks is usually that they don't play as many creatures, and you're usually in white or black, so you can play a lot of board wipes and not lose as much. But when you animate your enchantments, suddenly this benefit goes away, and then one board wipe also kills all your enchantments, and you're kind of in trouble. And enchantments are slow and somewhat weak as is, like I mentioned before. That said, this is still one of my favorite archetypes. It's why Humility plus Opalescence is one of my favorite synergies in the game. I think it's such a silly, goofy combo. Alright, so how powerful are enchantment decks overall? Well, optimized Enchantress decks can be decently powerful because they have some good support. And even though auras and enchantments have some weaknesses, the support cards somewhat make up for that, especially if you're in white and green. Some of these Aura Voltron decks are relatively efficient with their support cards and can knock a player out of the game pretty fast. The power of the non-Aura enchantment decks comes from the fact that people really don't play enough enchantment removal, and outside of a few key board wipes that hit everything, people rarely play Destroy All enchantment effects. Because of that, many players who do not pack flexible removal can struggle against enchantment decks. Even if the deck is not really that powerful, they're just not packing the right type of removal. And this is doubly so if you play some of the more stacksy sort of enchantments. If you play something like Spreading Plague or Smoke, some decks might really struggle against that. It can make these enchantment decks sometimes feel a little overpowered, although part of that is on the person not playing enchantment removal. Overall, I would rank Enchantress decks as somewhat mid-powered. They have some benefits and also weaknesses. The Voltron strategies are fragile, and the non-Voltron versions are slow. I don't think it's as powerful as an optimized artifact deck or a very tuned up tribal deck. Now, how expensive are Enchantress decks? Honestly, pretty cheap. A lot of the support cards are only a couple of dollars, and other than Replenish or Serra's Sanctum, there are not too many reserveless Enchantress cards that you would need, unless you want Chains of Mephistopheles or Nethervoid, but most players are not interested in those. I think an aura-based deck like Mazi or Hakim are very budget friendly, and if you wanted to build a new deck without breaking the bank, those are pretty great options. I think enchantment decks are very fun and can be built in many ways to suit your playstyle. And once you get the base of some of these support cards, it's really easy to splash in other colors or change the style of your Enchantress deck. Plus, new types of cards like Sagas and Cases usually bring new synergies that you can utilize. There's almost always going to be some interesting enchantment in an upcoming set. If you already play an enchantment deck, let me know your favorite Enchantress commanders in the comments below. I'd love to see it. I will also link my friend's Mazi deck so you can check it out. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more.